My success comes from learning from the mistakes of others. I am Abraham Lincoln, and this is my Autobiologue. Well now, I confess I am not entirely certain what to make of this arrangement. A man speaks into a box, and somewhere, in some room I shall never see, in some year I could not have imagined another man or woman looks back at him. I've been told this is ordinary now. I suppose a great many things that would have struck me as witchcraft are ordinary now. I will say this much in the contraption's favor. It is considerably more patient with my appearance than most audiences were. The newspapers of my own day were not so kind. One correspondent, if I recall it correctly, described my face as a sad argument against the notion that the Almighty takes particular care with his finer work. I could not altogether disagree with him, but I did not come here to discuss my face. I came, I suppose, because the things I learned, not in any school, for I had precious little of those, but in the long, cold, particular school of living a difficult life in a difficult time. Well, it may be that some portion of that learning is still of use. I was 9 years old the winter my family settled in Indiana, Pigeon Creek. The cabin had a dirt floor, packed hard by December, cold enough to ache through the soles of whatever you had on your feet. We had a fire. Most nights we had a fire. I would lie on my stomach near it to read. The light was flat and orange, and good for maybe 1 page at a time before you had to move closer. I did not mind. I was always reading. Whatever I could find, I read until I had it whole. My mother would sometimes sit near that fire in the evenings. I can see her face in it still, just her face, in the firelight. I will leave that thought there for now and come back to it. Because when I look out at this year of yours, this loud, bright, fast, and terribly divided year, I find that the cabin is the right place to begin. You see, I have been listening. Not to any one voice in particular, to the shape of it, the noise your world makes when it argues with itself. And I will tell you what I hear, plainly and without ceremony. I have heard it before. The particular machinery is new to me, I grant you that. I am given to understand that a man may now sit alone in a room and speak his convictions into the air, and that air will carry those convictions only to the ears of those who already agree with him, and return them amplified, and he will sit back and conclude that the whole of creation shares his views. That is a remarkable piece of engineering. It is also, if I may say so, a very old human habit dressed up in new clothes. I split a good many fence rails when I was young. It was honest work, and it taught me something about the nature of wood and the nature of division. You take a single rail, one piece, one grain running clean through the center, and you split it down the middle. Now you have 2 rails. They are identical in their grain. They came from the same tree, and yet, once separated, each one will forget that. Each one will look across the gap at the other and call it foreign. That is your house divided. It was mine in 1858. It is yours in 2026. The plain truth is this: a house is not divided by disagreement. Men have always disagreed, and the Republic has survived it. A house is divided by certainty, by the absolute conviction that the disagreement itself proves the other side to be monstrous. If this is true, then consider what follows. A man who believes his neighbor is merely wrong can still sit down with him. A man who believes his neighbor is evil cannot. He can only fight him, or flee him, or wait for him to be destroyed. That certainty is the rot. Not the argument. The certainty about the argument. I learned this at considerable cost, and I did not learn it as a hero. The plain truth is this: I was not born an emancipator. I was not sent by Providence, fully formed, to cleanse the nation of its sin. I was a lawyer from Illinois, a Whig, a man who had read the Constitution with care and sworn an oath to it, and who believed, with complete sincerity, that the abolitionists, for all the righteousness of their feeling, were doing more damage to the legal fabric of the Union than they understood. I want you to hold that thought, because it is not a comfortable one. I have always felt that slavery was wrong. I cannot remember a time when I did not feel it. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. That is not a political position. That is a thing I knew in my body, the way a man knows cold. And yet, feeling that a thing is wrong does not grant a president of the United States the legal authority to abolish it by proclamation in the states where it already exists. The Constitution is not a document that bends to moral urgency. I had sworn to preserve it. The question before me was never whether slavery was wrong. The question was what, within the law, I was empowered to do about it, and when. Let us suppose a man writes the following words in a letter published for all the nation to read in the late summer of 1862. He writes, "My paramount object is to save the Union. If I can save it without freeing any enslaved person, I will do that. If I can save it by freeing all, I will do that. If I can save it by freeing some and leaving others, I will do that also. If this is true, then that man sounds like a cold calculator, a politician without conviction." That is how those words were read by many. That is how they have sometimes been read since. Here is what those words do not tell you. The Emancipation Proclamation was already written when I sent that letter. It was sitting in my desk. I had drafted it in July. I had already told my cabinet I intended to issue it. I was waiting only for a Union victory on the field, so that the proclamation would read as strength rather than desperation. I was not being evasive. I was managing the border states, the cabinet, the Congress, the public, and the generals, all at the same time, with a single instrument that had to serve all of them simultaneously without destroying any of them. Being a radical hero is easy. A radical hero announces his virtue and is done with it. He does not have to govern the morning after. He does not have to hold Missouri in the Union while he frees the slaves of Virginia. He does not have to answer for what happens to the men who enlisted to save the Constitution if they conclude the Constitution has been set aside. That is not cowardice. That is the specific, grinding, unglamorous weight of legal and moral leadership. History tends to sand it smooth and call it courage after the fact. I will tell you it did not feel like courage at the time. It felt like arithmetic. The proclamation was a war measure. It was legally grounded in the war powers of the commander-in-chief. I was not performing righteousness. I was constructing an instrument that the law could hold, that the Union could survive, and that the future could build upon. The conviction was always there. The law had to be brought to it, carefully, at the right moment, in the right form. That weight I carried in the office. But the weight of those years was not carried in the office alone. It was carried home to a house that had its own particular darkness. I have always felt that a man ought to be honest about his constitution, the same as he is honest about the constitution of the land he farms. Some soil is good. Some has a hardness to it that no amount of labor entirely corrects. Mine had a hardness to it. I do not say this for sympathy. I say it because it is a plain fact about the person I was, and you cannot understand the rest of what I am going to tell you without knowing it. There were seasons, and I use that word with care, because it came and went the way seasons do. Without asking permission, there were seasons when a dark cloud would settle over me, and I could not see the purpose of the next day's work, not from laziness, not from weakness of will. It was simply there, the way cold is simply there in November. I called it the hypo, which was the common enough word for it. I carried it my whole life. It was, I suppose, as much a part of me as my height or my regrettable face. A man learns to work in difficult soil. He does not always manage it gracefully. I did not always manage it gracefully. It was into that life, the hypo, the long silences, the stretches of a heavy heart, that Mary Todd arrived, and I want to be careful here, because she deserves more than a careful man's careful words, and I am not certain I am equal to her. She was sharper than most men I knew in politics. I do not say that as a compliment offered to a woman. I say it as a plain assessment. She understood the machinery of ambition and influence with a clarity that I sometimes lacked, and on more than one occasion it was her reading of a situation that steadied mine. She wanted me to be president long before I was convinced the thing was either possible or wise. She also felt everything at a pitch that the world had not been arranged to accommodate. Her rages were real. Her grievances were sometimes difficult to account for by any outside observer, including myself. I cannot say, even now, that I always understood what she required of me. I suspect I failed to provide it more often than I knew. What I can say is this. She was too large for the space the world allotted her. Her intelligence had nowhere sufficient to go. Her feeling had no channel wide enough to carry it. I do not offer that as an excuse for the harder aspects of our life together. I offer it as the truest explanation I have. We lost our boy Eddie in the winter of 1850. He was not yet 4 years old. I will not dwell on it at length. I will say only that after Eddie, something changed in me that I cannot name precisely. Not in my beliefs, not in my work, in my body, somewhere. I began to understand, in a way I had not understood before, what it means to have something taken from you that you were not finished loving. I did not know, in the winter of 1850, that I would be made to understand it again, more completely, in a house much larger and much lonelier than the one on 8th Street in Springfield. And then came a night when the two great rooms of my life, the war I was commanding, and the family I was losing, occupied the same house. At the same hour, the 5th of February, 1862. There were perhaps 500 people in the house that night, gaslight through every window, music from somewhere below, the kind of noise that a city makes when it is trying, in the middle of a war, to remind itself that ordinary life is still possible. Willie was upstairs. He had been ill for some days. The fever did not break the way fevers are supposed to break. I went up before the guests arrived. I stood in the doorway of his room and watched him for a while. Then I went back down. There are things a president is required to do. I shook hands. I spoke to people whose names I have since forgotten. The music continued. I went back up. His breathing had a quality to it that I will not describe in detail. It was not the breathing of a boy who was getting better. I went back down. I do not remember how many times I made that climb. I remember the particular sound of the stairs. I remember the way the noise of the reception faded as I reached the upper hall and returned again as I descended. At some point late in the evening, I stood at the foot of his bed in the quiet of that room and watched his chest. I was not praying. Exactly. I was counting. Willie died on the 20th of February, 1862. He was 11 years old. I went to him. I stood beside him for a time. I said something to him. I cannot say here what it was. There are words that belong only to the person they are spoken to, and those were his. I will not reduce them by repeating them to anyone else. That is all I will tell you about that moment. In the same week, I signed orders committing 10,000 men to winter positions along the Tennessee River. I read the dispatches. I noted the numbers. I signed my name. I went back to work, because the work did not stop. The work never stopped. That is the particular cruelty of the office. The nation does not pause for a father's grief. The war does not pause. The telegraph does not pause. I signed the orders. Now, let me tell you what I understood after that I had not understood before. Not as a thought, as a fact I carried in my body from that point forward. A man may sign an order committing 10,000 souls to a valley and reckon it a military calculation. The numbers go in. The numbers come out. The objective is secured, or it is not. That is the arithmetic of command, and it is a necessary arithmetic, and a man in my position must be able to perform it, or he cannot function. But if that same man has stood in a quiet room and watched one boy go still, his own boy, taken by something that no order could stop and no strategy could address and no argument of necessity could justify to a father's understanding, if you have felt that, truly felt it, in your body and in your silence, then the calculation is not the same calculation anymore. Then you know, with a knowledge that does not leave you, what you are spending when you spend it. Every order after Willie was signed by a man who knew what he was spending. That understanding did not make me hesitate when hesitation was wrong, but it made the cost real in a way it had not been real before. Each name on each list was somebody's boy. Somebody was counting. That understanding changed how I read the war's purpose, and it changed what I believed the Almighty was requiring of this nation before he would permit it to be finished. We cannot escape history. Both sides read the same Bible. Both knelt before the same God. Both lifted their voices in the same earnest petition that the Almighty might look down upon their particular cause and find it worthy of his favor. I could not, in good conscience, grant either side that endorsement, and I confess to you now, I could not grant it to my own. The plain truth is this: slavery was not a Southern invention that a virtuous North was compelled to destroy. The The North had worn the cotton. The North had counted the profits. The North had written the Fugitive Slave Act into law and looked the other way for 250 years while the lash did its arithmetic. American slavery was an American sin. And if the Almighty willed that the wealth piled by the bondsman's unrequited toil should be sunk, and that every drop of blood drawn by the lash should be paid by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must still be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That is not politics. That is consequence. But I will tell you what frightened me more than the enemy's cannon. It was the certainty on both sides of the line. Certainty forecloses the moral imagination. It transforms a man who holds a different value into a monster, and monsters cannot be reasoned with. They can only be destroyed. The most dangerous man in a republic is not the man who is wrong. It is the man who cannot conceive that he might be. And so I chose my words with the care of a man who knows he is building something that must outlast him. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, not as we have decided, not as we have declared from our pulpits and our newspapers, as we are permitted to see imperfectly, provisionally, with the humility of beings who have been grievously wrong before and will be again. The qualifier is everything. That small phrase, as God gives us to see, is not weakness. It is the only honest sentence a responsible man can speak in a time of war. It is the difference between a statesman and a zealot. I allowed myself, finally, to believe the Union would survive, that the Constitution would be made whole. And then came the evening I had always, in a quiet part of myself, expected. I suppose I must speak of the dream. It had come often enough that I no longer regarded it as an omen. A dark vessel, moving swiftly over black water. Ahead of me, a shore I could not quite discern. No trees, no buildings, no welcome. Only the certainty of approach. I never arrived. I only drew nearer. It came again on the morning of April 14th. I noted it without alarm. The way a man notes a shift in the weather, something in the air, a pressure. And then I rose, dressed, and stepped into the day. Richmond had fallen. General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The amendment was passing through the states. The rebellion was broken. The Union preserved. The long fracture in the fence was mended. A reasonable man might have said the work was finished. And perhaps that is the most dangerous moment in any struggle, the moment one believes the accounting complete. I have never found the word tragedy sufficient for what occurred that evening. Tragedy suggests interruption, accident, a life cut short in the midst of promise. But the nation had been running a long debt, in blood, in compromise, in 250 years of deliberate blindness. Debts accrue interest. They do not vanish because we prefer not to examine the ledger. I had spent 4 years signing letters to mothers, reading casualty reports that arrived like weather fronts. I had authorized movements that sent boys into valleys and received back columns of numbers. Somewhere in the middle of those years, I ceased fearing death. A man cannot correspond daily with mortality and remain startled by it. It becomes familiar. Not welcome, but familiar. It sits beside you at the desk. So when the shot came, I did not experience it as catastrophe. I experienced it as conclusion. Not a punishment, not even, properly speaking, a sacrifice. A closing of accounts. The vessel reached its shore. The ledger balanced. And if I am to leave you, you who inhabit this strange, bright year of 2026, with anything at all, it is this. Nations do not escape the consequences of what they build their prosperity upon. They may postpone the reckoning. They may rename it. They may distribute it across generations. But the arithmetic remains, and in the end, the account is settled. So I turn to you. You who live not on battlefields, but in an age where ideas and institutions are tested. Noise is high, reactions are swift, patience scarce. Do not mistake comfort for virtue. The Republic is preserved not by memory alone, but by restraint, by the discipline to doubt your own certainty, by the refusal to declare a fellow citizen an enemy merely because he stands across from you. We have erred greatly. We have paid dearly. Yet the experiment endures, not because we are innocent, but because we are capable of amendment. If you would be worthy of this inheritance, prove the argument again. Prove that free people entrusted with power can govern the house in which they live without tearing it down. Prove that liberty need not decay into license, nor disagreement into destruction. Prove by patience, by courage, by law, that this union is not an accident of history, but an achievement of character. The last best hope of earth does not reside in our strength alone. It resides in our self-command. Guard it. Strengthen it. And when your time comes to sign the ledger, let it be said that you added to the credit and did not merely spend what was given. That will be enough.